Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Simply Finance with Shane White. Today is one I wanted to do around a concept that I think is very commonly talked about at this time of year. And I think with COVID, it's become something that maybe is on the front of all of our minds. And it's this, to be honest, this one today is not really much to do with finance. It will a little bit. We'll bring some finance into this. Um, it's really about what this year has brought, and really the concept, and just what I want to walk through today is change. Just the word change, and what that means, for any of you listening, and what that can mean for all of you as we go forward into 2021. I'm bringing this up because, this year for me, I kicked this podcast off in March when COVID really started getting bad. And, it's turned into my most favorite hobby, really, like exercising and being healthy. And this podcast have become the ways I unplug from work. So, in the mornings, I used to commute to work in the city of Chicago. In the evenings, I used to commute home. Now we don't have that disconnect. And this podcast is what I filled both of those voids with. And it was a way for me to, build something for me, add value for all of you in a way that I thought was hopefully meaningful to as many people as possible. And it was a way to do something, I always felt like we're going to look back on this time of COVID, and you're either going to feel like you did something productive with the extra time, whether that's, building something or spending more time with family and friends that you live with. Maybe it's getting healthier, or, I think a lot of people to know, and like to not shit on anybody at all, because if you didn't do something that you're proud of during COVID, I think that's probably the norm. I mean, we've been stuck inside. We've been dealing with not seeing people like we normally do. We've been kind of doing the same routine. And a lot of people, I think, are in the shoes of feeling like they didn't, maybe get the most out of the additional time that they were given during COVID. And this episode is not to, shit on any of that or any of that. But this year has been all about change, right? We've had to change the way we interact with people. Now it's 6 feet apart. It's you wearing a mask everywhere you go in public. It's not shaking hands as much anymore. Hugs are only for those very far, few in between interactions, maybe with close family or people who you see a lot. Change comes with the way a lot of us work. If you're someone like me in the business world, we're not all in an office anymore. We're all on Zoom all day, or whatever it is, video chat that you use. And that is change that came in a blink of an eye that no one saw coming. And, um, but we're always surrounded by some sort of change. And I think, a lot of people think of the end of the year, and then really like the beginning of next year. It's people famously do a lot of, new goals and New Year's resolutions and all that stuff. And don't get me wrong, in the last couple of years, I've gotten more into setting goals for the year and having the New Year's resolution type stuff. I used to never, ever think about that stuff, to be honest, growing up as a kid and even in college and early on after college. But really in the last few years, I have started to do that. But one thing that I try to do before all that is reflect on the year. So I like to spend, the month of December really looking back, thinking about what this year brought, what I'm proud of that I accomplished, what maybe I'm not happy with what I did, whether that's, not hitting a goal, whether that's not working hard enough on something, whether that's just, something I totally fucked up. And, I learned from this year. The start of this year, it was also for me the first time I ever really started journaling. I used something called a bullet journal. I kind of started at the end of last year. I've always dabbled between, things on the computer, whether that's like like a Google sheet or, Word documents, nothing consistent. And then, so this is the first year I've, consistently kind of done that. That was a change for me. For me, it was a positive change where it allowed me to, plan out my months, my weeks, my days a lot better. And really, a change for me this year that I don't know if I've really talked about on here before, but a lot of the momentum of this podcast, what I attribute a lot of the direction that this podcast has grown to, we're nearing 100 episodes of Simply Finance, which is insane. I would have never thought I would have made this many episodes. I'm not there yet, but we're on track to hit that milestone in a few weeks. Um, you know, One of the changes for me was breaking down these big goals into smaller daily attainable tasks. That's a change that I reflected on at the end of last year that I needed to learn how to do, because for me, I've not always, but recently over the last few years, have become someone who um, sets big goals for themselves, but then becomes overwhelmed by the weight and the gravity of those goals. So finding a way to break them down into smaller monthly, weekly, and then ultimately daily tasks to accomplish these big goals is a change that I had to make. So that's a version of change that in my own life I'm sharing as an example, something maybe you guys can all think about and take away from. And I'm not going to go into great detail today about a major change that's happening. I probably will. Maybe I'll do an episode someday about it, or I might record it and just not post it yet and wait for someday to share it with the world and my audience. But there was a major change a couple of weeks ago that's happening in my life, and kind of the reason behind this episode is just the reflecting that I've done over the last couple of weeks, and I kind of realized this was one that was surprising to me. It's in the professional world for me, and I'm starting to just realize that this is the reality of life. That there's whenever you get too, I don't even want to say confident at all. It wasn't a confidence thing. It was more of a when things are going well or things have been happening the same way for a while, um, they always change. And I think it's funny sometimes in my career, especially in finance. And this is where I'm tying finance back into this. I've run into points in my young career where, I kind of get past that point of, I'll use the word struggle. I don't know if any of you work in the professional environment and you work for maybe a large company in any function, usually the first few weeks, few months consist of a kind of what's called like an uphill battle, or a, drinking water out of a fire hose is what we say sometimes at work. And it's like there's so much to learn. You're not a professional at this like section of a business you're starting to help with. You're trying to just absorb and learn, and you sit there and there's times where you're just like overwhelmed, or you're confused, or you just feel like there's so much that you need to get done that you don't necessarily know how to do yet. And that's where, asking questions, um, you know, having the humility to know that you don't know everything, and that you need to have the self-awareness to reach out to others who might know the answers to those questions. But eventually you get to a place, especially in an organization where, you know, things maybe a tougher year, or you've grown to a certain size. So the growth isn't like as crazy month over month as it used to be. You kind of get to a point where you become like an expert in your lane, right? You know what you're working on. You know the ins and outs of what you're working on. And sometimes change is needed, and I'm saying all this to basically get to the point that even when change is frightening, it scares you, it leaves you with uncertainty. It's maybe not what you chose. It's, sometimes change is handed to you, right? And it's not necessarily your decision to have this change. But I'm sure I'm starting to pivot in my career and in my life to realize that a lot of times this change is good. This is where we grow. We grow in the change. Every time I've either switched jobs or moved or started at a new school or even at school starting in a new class each semester, that moment of uncertainty, awkwardness, not knowing people, not knowing what you're working on or how to do it perfectly, those are when you grow the most. That's when you learn the most. And like I said, sometimes you're choosing change, sometimes change is getting handed to you. Um, but what I want, hopefully, anyone listening to this, if you decide to listen to this episode today, um, the takeaway for me, and I wanted to just share because it kind of hit me today, was that you can always look at change in two ways. You can look at it as a negative, where you're like, why me? Why did this change affect me? Or even if you chose it, you know, why did I choose this? I could have just stayed what I was doing, and I could have been happy and been just shown up, got my stuff done, and left, and nothing would have been a challenge. But then you also don't grow, and you stagnate, and you begin to um, not push boundaries, not stretch your imagination, stretch your knowledge, stretch yourself as a professional, and maybe even as a creator. And you can also look at it on the flip side, where change is tough. It's hard. There's nothing easy about it, but there will be light at the end of the tunnel, even if you don't see it right now. You got to keep moving forward. You got to just jump out and see what's on the other side of change. And something I'm going through right now, like I said, without getting into detail of what the change is that I'm dealing with, this can be applied to anyone. And for a lot of us, this year has been filled with this. And I think for the most part, this year, change has been filled with a lot of angst and a lot of worry. And so I hope some of you can hear this and think positively about change that either is happening to you, may happen to you soon or in the future. Um, Change is when we figure out what we're supposed to do, what we want to do. Change forces us to adapt, to learn, and ultimately to get better. And just maybe there's a reason behind those changes that get handed to you. Um, you know, Without change, we'll never know what else is out there. We'll never know what else we could be accomplishing, what we could be trying, what we could be doing. Like I said at the very beginning of this, to be completely honest with you, I've wanted to start a podcast for years. I've told Kelly, my wife, multiple times. There was something, I remember 2014. I had an hour commute to my first job ever in corporate America. And I started listening to the Tim Ferriss Show. That was the first podcast I ever listened to. It was on the iTunes podcast app. Someone sent me a link to an episode. I had never seen it before. I didn't even know what a podcast really was. I honestly thought it was something that like older people listen to, and it was like old, boring, like NPR type shows. And that then turned into me finding Joe Rogan. Obviously going from Tim Ferriss, where he's interviewing people, but he's, for the most part, it's very well thought out, it's very well delivered, it's edited very nicely. Then going to Joe Rogan, you're like, holy shit, is the Wild West. They can say whatever they want. They're getting drunk, they're doing drugs on the podcast. I started to see like, oh, this can be anything you want it to be. This can be as wild or as professional. What a cool platform. And so I kind of fell in love with just like, how cool is it that people are making a job out of talking to people? And I think part of it's because I resonated with that. I've always loved talking with people, communicating, having cool conversations. Then I started seeing on these podcasts, Tim and Joe, they're having sit down conversations with people that like most people never get a chance to talk to. And I just thought that was so cool. And I always wanted to do this. But life's crazy, life's busy, and who makes time to sit down and start a podcast? It's not the easiest thing in the world for sure. And it's definitely not the easiest thing to just finally go and do. And then March of 2020 happened. change was handed to me. And all of a sudden I'm forced to be at my house all day, every day. I have a gym in our garage. There was no leaving except maybe to go to like a grocery store. And I just remember sitting there one day and being like, this is a sign. If you ever wanted a sign to give you some extra time in your morning, in your evening, I've never, ever, this is the first time in my life, the first time in, 6 years of working professionally, almost 7 now, that I haven't had to commute. So I'm sitting here and I'm like, I have a job. I don't have to commute. This is my opportunity, my chance. This is a change in my life that will allow me the time to start this podcast. And I did it. And I can tell you it's been hard. There's been times where I've sat here and I've been like, should I keep doing this? Especially early on. There's always going to be doubt in your mind. But then just like Tim and Joe, if any of you have been listening to this podcast long enough, I took a shot. I figured out a way, and I got a yes from someone I look up to in Matt Frazier. One of the fittest people on earth, a CrossFit Games legend, said yes to come on to my podcast. And I guess the whole point, and I didn't know if I was going to go down this route or not, of this episode in change is that I could have either sat there and not done anything with the extra time I had. By all means, I could have slept in more. In the evenings, I could have just played video games, started drinking. I mean, you know what I mean? Like I could have done with not having to commute. It wasn't like all of a sudden this podcast was handed to me. It was change that was handed to me, a change in my routine. And I decided, I was like, hey, I want to make the most of this. And I could have never imagined that I would be sitting here today recording this podcast with the guests that I've had on, with the guests I have planned right now, with the ideas that I want to accomplish with this platform. It's just so fun. I feel lucky and blessed that this is all happening. And it's just been an enjoyable ride. And I've loved having this. I tell Kelly now all the time, I said, no matter what my future looks like, I can't envision it now without having this podcast. I think no matter what I do, whether this would ever become successful enough to be on its own and be the thing I focus on full time, it's been so much fun to meet people, have cool conversations, ask questions, and just really, meet more people and have cool conversations. And yeah, so that was a change. That was a story that I wanted to kind of tell you guys all about. I'm going through a huge change right now, and there's only two ways to look at it: positive or negatively. Either you pick change or it's handed to you. And I hope all of you, as you head into the last month of 2020, I know it's been a hell of a year for most of us. And but think about it. What happened this year that was change for you in your life? Did you handle it well? Did you not? If you didn't, that's great. Write it down, learn from it, do something different in 2021 that you didn't do in 2020. And I hope this helps. Anyway, folks, thanks for listening. I appreciate all the support as always. This one is very different for this channel, but I just felt like I needed to record this one. So if you liked this and you felt like my message made any sense whatsoever, would love if you'd send this to one friend or family member, because maybe it'll help them. Maybe they've had a tough 2020 and they just need to hear how positive you can spin this whole thing. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate all the love and support that I constantly get from all of you guys. Thank you for listening. I have some really great guests that I'm releasing soon, episodes that were recently recorded, and some that are upcoming that I'm fired up about. So as always, thanks for listening. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. See ya.